Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special recording of the Legend Fiction Show. This is for our upcoming con, LegendHaven, and I'm really happy to be back with Tasha Kazanjian. Hi, Tasha. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
So, you weren't with us last year for the actual con, but you were present, and you have been on the podcast maybe twice now. I just can't remember, or once,
Once or
but
twice, yeah.
once or twice. We've had a couple of different fun conversations, and so we figured let's talk about research to create an immersive setting because you're working on a historical fantasy novel coming out next year, May of 2024. So, um, first, what was your experience of LegendHaven last year? Because that was our first time figuring it all out.
Yeah, it was so fun. I mean, it was great to connect with other people in some of just like little hangouts that happened. And the talks were great. And also the pitch session with Anjanette Barr was fantastic. And also it got me in touch with her and she now represents me as my agent. So I mean, it was just overall a great experience and I felt like I made really good connections.
That is awesome. Well, there you go. What a win, people. So you better come and join us for free October 14th, Legend Haven this year. Links in the description. So you've got an agent now representing you, and you've got a novel
Mhm.
coming out next year. Since we're going to talk about research to create immersive worlds, and our whole theme is like worlds without end, can you give us a little bit of a teaser or an overview of the book that you're writing? What is it called? What's the direction you're taking?
Yeah, so it's called A Trick of Spades. It is technically high fantasy, but I consider it historical fantasy because the
Hmm.
setting is very heavily inspired by 1960s London.
Hmm.
So there's lots of magic and lots of fun things going on, but I also had to do a lot of incredibly detailed research in order to
Wow.
build that world.
Hmm.
And it follows two teenagers as they try and rescue their aunt, who is a bounty hunter and got tangled up with the wrong crime lord. So
As
it's
one
a lot of
does.
fun.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
But yes.
Wow. Okay, first, what's the difference? How would you define the difference between historical fiction versus historical fantasy? And like how hard is the research perhaps in either way?
Um, I mean, I think that you probably have a little bit more leeway on historical fantasy, but I honestly don't think you should. I think that I mean, you can, but the way I approach it, I really like doing the research. So with historical fiction, you're trying to make it as realistic to that time period as possible. You don't want to have any fantastical elements necessarily. It's just supposed to be very real, very realistic. And then historical fantasy, you have that very grounded historical setting, but you also throw in some kind of magical element. So, it's London in the Victorian era, but also there are wizards, something like that.
Hmm. Very cool. I'll just trim this. I was thinking of something while you were talking.
Mhm.
Let me just ask for a second, like, what are some of your favorite novels when it comes to like historical fantasy, where kind of like what you're doing? Maybe if you were
Mhm.
to say my novel is kind of like these other novels in a comparative
Mhm.
sense, what would you pick?
Um, my mind immediately goes to two different novels, and honestly, the whole genre of like or subgenre of historical fantasy, I feel like that's a pretty recent label that we've been putting on things.
Okay.
Um, but I mean, I haven't done a lot of looking into that, but I'd say that's a pretty recent label. I don't think I heard that as much
Hmm.
until the last couple of years. But two series come to mind. One is it starts with the book The Apothecary. It's by Miley Malloy. It
Hmm.
is set in 1950s London. Actually, it's very well researched historical setting, but also they're trying to use magical chemistry to fight radiation from atomic bombs, which obviously
Oh
is
wow.
not history. um, but it feels very gritty and realistic
Hmm.
and very you can tell the author did a lot of work on this, but also there's this fun magical element. And then
Hmm.
another one that comes to mind for me is the Leviathan series by Scott Westerfeld,
Okay.
um, which is World War One, except that it's an all-out war between the Axis powers use mechanics and the Allied powers use strange biological creature weaponry. I don't
Huh.
really know how else to explain it, but there are great illustrations. Mhm.
Okay, so you mentioned that historical fantasy is something that is a little more recent as a genre, and I'm curious, what did it what did we used to sort of lump it in as, and maybe why do you think it's something people are more interested in today?
Yeah, I think that probably in the past it was just considered fantasy, so it wouldn't have been labeled historical fantasy, and it just would have been lumped in with any other low or high fantasy that's kind of out there. Um, I think that it's maybe emerging as a genre, partly because a lot of like subgenres have become more of a thing lately. I think
Mm-hmm.
just in terms of there's been more diversity, just in terms of genres themselves, and trying to
Mm-hmm.
maybe categorize them a little bit more as more and more books are coming out, especially within something like the fantasy genre. So it covers such a wide spectrum of different books at this point that I think marketers just find it helpful to have new labels for things.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. I want to come back and ask you about your experience working with Enginet, but first let's talk
Mhm.
about so the research to build the immersive setting. Where do you want to go with that? Because I'm really intrigued. Like you say, you're as rigorous maybe as it comes in not letting yourself off the hook and just hand waving things away. So
Yeah.
tell us about that process for you.
Um, I'm going to use a funny little example from, so I have a short story. It's
Hmm.
really more of a novella called Peter and the Never Girl. It's a reimagining of Peter Pan.
Hmm.
And it's set in London in 1980. And I went to an estate sale recently, and there was a particular type of coffee pot in a cupboard. And I looked up at it, and I grabbed my sister, who I was there with, and I was like, "That is a Polly Perk, and it was made in the 1970s." And she's like, "Okay." And I
Dork.
was like, "Well, I know it because there's two lines in one of my short stories in which somebody had to use a coffee maker, and I tried to
Oh.
figure out what kind of coffee pot might reasonably be in a pub in 1980, and that's the one that I chose."
Hmm.
And I think that, to me, I love putting these little details in there
Hmm.
just to give even the reader maybe that sense, something of the sense that I get running into that object in reality. I can sort of mimic that for my reader of really being able to visualize the world of that setting where you're in that pub kitchen, you're in that space, and you can picture everything very clearly and it feels real.
That level of specificity too, I think it does create a little boost of trust. It does for me as a reader every
Mhm.
time. It's like I may not even know what that thing is, but the author knows what it is, which means they knows what they're talking about, which means I can trust that this is going somewhere and like they've done their homework and like they're serious about this. Um,
Mhm.
so I think it's a little credibility booster for sure.
Yeah, I actually think about it in terms of, there's this quote from Tolkien in his essay on fairy stories, which I love, where he's talking about the difference between willing suspension of disbelief and secondary belief. And he says that state of mind has been called willing suspension of disbelief, but that does not seem to me a good description of what happens. What really happens is that the storymaker proves a successful sub creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken. The magic, or rather art, has failed. And I just come back to that in terms of, you're not just saying to your reader, hey, you have to believe me because I'm the author. You have to create a world which they just believe and feels real.
What are so the ways that you have done that have worked really well for you, or that ways that you're happy with, the ways that you're seeing in books that you've read, apart from like maybe picking up these little specific details? What are things that you do that help you feel like this is I'm building something immersive? You know, it's winning me over, or it's won me over when I've been reading things.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like you were just saying that I was bringing up with the coffee pot. It is those small details where you're just like, "Oh, I don't necessarily know exactly what this is, but clearly the author does." So, you know, this feels very realistic. Where I think it's often even the things that aren't major in the story, it's not about just like the big historical events that might be happening or the broad strokes, but those small details or one line that, reading it, wow, that probably came from a lot of research, but it's now been condensed into one line, which I can just kind of fly past. And it isn't necessarily hugely important to the story, but it is still a part of kind of creating that world. And I'd
Yeah.
say another thing is the way that an author can use those things to impact their character and their character's motivations an outlook on life, which is often, I think we're very much often the product of our environments to a certain extent anyway. So when you as an author know your character's environment really well, you actually also know your characters better.
How far back in the past does something need to be considered historical fantasy? Because the novel that I'm writing, it's like set in present day London. So I'm doing a bunch of this stuff that you're kind of messing around with as well. It's a bit of a side question. Do you know how, like, is it 5 years in the past or just like?
I don't know. I think that's a really good question. I've never thought about it too hard. The farthest back I've gone would be, sorry, the closest,
Mhm.
the nearest would be 1980.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
40 years-ish. But I don't know. I feel like if you wrote something that was set in the early 2000s, that would still count as historical.
Yeah.
If you wrote
But do you
something
think it'd be
super
branded more like
historical,
contemporary? I don't know, modern or realistic fantasy? Actually, they call it like magical realism a little bit, don't they?
a little bit, I think. That's kind of its own genre at
So
this
when
point.
you go to research, like Google and Google Earth have become my best friends, and then there's like researching travelogues are brilliant for finding those little
Mhm.
bits of details for people who are actually there. He's like, oh, thank you, copy, paste.
Yes.
Wasn't there a line from like Richard Gaiman when he's like, when you do research, it's the equivalent of like window shopping in a, what is it, like a jewelry store, and then you punch
Mm.
your hand through the glass and you grab the one thing you need and then you book it and you don't stick around for everything else because you can't do everything. So
Right.
how do you go about gathering details and researching and maybe knowing when to stop?
Um, I mean, I think, like you just said, Google Maps is my friend. Anytime I'm, trying to plot out a story, I mean, the amount of times that I had to figure out, okay, how long would it take to walk from this place to this place within London, and just
Hmm.
having to memorize that. But Google Maps definitely helps. Um,
Hmm.
I'd say that. Uh, I mean, Google in general, you can access so many things. I'm a huge fan of book research personally.
Hmm.
Um, so I'd always say get to know the reference section at your library pretty well, because you can just go
Okay.
in, find the section on what you're looking for, grab
Hmm.
all of the books, and you don't have to read everything cover to cover.
Yeah.
But you can skim things and maybe pick one that you're going to read cover to cover. And then if
Hmm.
it doesn't have what you want, there's always the references section in the back, which, I mean, looking into references. So I'll be reading something and I'm like, oh, this one random detail, I need more about that. You look in the back and suddenly it's like, oh, well, there are 3 sources I could look at to know
Hmm.
more about that. So that's been really helpful. But I think one of my favorite ways of researching is finding my local expert. So
Okay.
I I feel like many of the people that I meet are weirdly experts on some random thing. And it's not
Hmm.
necessarily something that they just like talk about all the time, but if you ask, suddenly you'll find, oh, this person at one point in their life did extensive study into, like, I don't know, weapons of 16th century Japan, and they just decided, you know what, I'm going to become an expert on this.
Hmm.
And then you can ask them all of your questions about it, and bam, you're good. Or I live with a surgeon. So anytime anybody gets injured, I just ask her, what would this actually do to somebody? How much of a recovery time am I looking at?
Yeah. I found more recently also, because I can't get to the library as often as I'd like to. So apart from
Mhm.
Google, the other tool that's been pretty amazing is like there are AI tools as well. Like
Mhm.
ChatGPT has been just pretty incredible for
Mhm.
giving a quick sense of where to go or what to think of, and then to then go back to Google and sort of follow that rabbit trail. Or Google Bard has its own, and it'll like pull in reference links and stuff, so you can actually go research source material and stuff. So
Yeah.
that's been a pretty constant friend for me, because I think I would probably have annoyed somebody to death with the amount of brainstorming I would need to do. Like, oh, look at these historical facts about Lebanon. How do I work that in? No person would want those conversations with me. So it's actually nice to have an AI that way
Mhm.
to chat with. So building building the sense of immersion. So you've talked about small details, and you've talked about things that a character is going to uh, engage with or interact with. Is there anything else that you want to add to that?
Um, I think the other thing I would add to it is simply that it can be helpful for you as a writer in
Hmm.
terms of plotting to do research.
Hmm.
Because I don't know how many times I've been reading about something historical and I thought, oh, that's a really interesting thing that happened. I wonder what if. And
Hmm.
then I kind of take it and I can twist it or apply it somehow to something I'm writing. And it's very, very helpful. Where I might be stuck with writer's block in terms of what's going to happen next in this plot.
Mm-hmm.
And then, reading about a fire in London in the 1840s is suddenly like, oh, that would work. Okay, we're going to do this,
I tell you, I love looking up untold stories or weird facts about
Mm-hmm.
whatever subject, or reasons why people hate anything about anything. Excuse me. Because you
Mm-hmm.
always get like weird and interesting Reddit rabbit holes
Yeah.
where like, oh, most people have never heard of this sort of thing. So this would be really cool to actually kind of incorporate. I'm curious what you think about this one. Sort of, it's a personal constraint I gave myself for writing my own novel in the sense of trying to create something immersive, was to not share any world building really or any information that the character themselves could not have known. So I went firmly first person point of view and
Mm-hmm.
then tried to stick purely with their observation. So it helped me avoid like any info dumping, and it also might allow them to be an unreliable narrator or to maybe get things wrong that I could correct through later on through different research. But what's been really cool to be able to do that has been to limit the perception of the world and the time period and so on to that person's ability to understand it. So like you mentioned the coffee pot, for example, like I would not know that detail, right?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, maybe I can afford my character that same sense of like, maybe I can describe it because I found it on Google Images, but maybe she doesn't actually need to know the name of the thing because it's within her character not to know it. But because she's an archaeologist, she knows all of the Viking runes, So
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what you think about that and kind of how do you play with your character's observations of things and interacting with facts and not overwhelming with research, because we writers love our research and showing that we've done
Yeah.
it, called info dumping, right?
Right.
How are you handling that?
I think that's a really good rule that you have, not sharing anything that your, point of view character would not know. I think that that's also just really helpful in terms of when you're doing even historical research, you might run into something that, oh, well, we know a lot about this now because
Oh,
somebody
that's such a
did
really good point.
extensive
Yeah.
research on it. Like, I mean,
Hmm.
currently I'm reading a book about a government agency, which was actually primarily top secret during the time, that period that I'm writing.
Hmm.
So I might have a character from that agency who appears, but my
Hmm.
characters aren't going to know anything about this agency. I
Yeah.
might need to know everything about this agency, but
Hmm.
those characters can't actually know everything about this
Yeah.
agency. Um, so keeping in mind, or just like historical perspectives on something. Maybe you're talking
Hmm.
about a war, and now we have one view of that war, which has been influenced by all of the history and politics and everything
All
that's
the
happened.
2020 vision on it and the
Yeah.
research and yeah.
But what would somebody have thought about it when it was
Hmm.
actually happening? And
Yeah.
can you mimic that well by even, looking at, okay, are there firsthand accounts of this? What were people saying
Hmm.
about it at the time? What was
Yeah.
the media doing?
Yeah. So you mentioned like 1980s, and I'm thinking like Stranger Things, and I remember
Yes.
looking at some of those tiny little. It's like 2 seconds where they're panning over somebody's junk drawer, and there's stuff in there that's like, yeah, that's not in my drawer today. I can't imagine the research that department had to do to make that junk drawer authentic. Like, who would do that?
Hmm.
Dorks would do that. Dorks rule. When it comes to that kind of immersion, that sense of like we can really
Hmm.
believe that we're here. You mentioned that point of thinking through the eyes, through the lens of somebody in the past. So how are you kind of getting into the mindset of what somebody might think about a certain thing, or how close you kind of get into it, given that it's a fantasy story, but in 1980s London?
Um, well, I think it was media is actually super helpful for this. I mean, that's not going to be
Oh,
super, I mean, it's not
interesting.
going to be as helpful if you're going further back in the past, obviously.
Right.
But even if you're just looking at, say, before there was necessarily television about
Hmm.
the news, maybe there are newspapers that you can read through, because that might not be everybody's perspective, but it is giving you maybe one person's
Hmm.
perspective on something. And then if you have the chance, if you're writing in an era where there's, media, even if one thing that I've gotten to do a lot of lately, which is just really fun, is just like watching TV shows from the 70s, the 80s, that kind of thing, where I'm like, what
Okay.
was on TV? What were people filling their heads with on a regular evening basis,
Hmm.
And asking people, again, if you're doing more recent stuff, you can ask people who remember that time or remember it
Yeah.
fairly well or had parents who told stories, that kind of
Hmm.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's something that's always been particularly compelling for me is to be reading a character and then to be like just impressed with this is what they thought the future was going to be, either in a good way or like a bad way, and
Mhm.
then this is how they're acting in light of that, and then we are now in the future and we realize, yeah, it didn't actually happen that way because all sorts of reasons. So to find and uncover those compelling reasons. Now, you also mentioned you're doing fantasy, so how does
Mhm.
fantasy start to I know you mentioned you're trying to be rigorous about things because you want to create a really compelling immersive world. So how are you having fun with fantasy in this, and what are some rules maybe you're making for yourself for, oh, that's a little too much fantasy, this is not Alice in Wonderland or Gandalf or
Mhm.
Brandon Sanderson or whatever? What are some rules that you're creating for your own novel here?
I think it depends on the novel. Some of my historical fantasy leans a little bit heavier on the fantasy. The book I have coming out in May, there's lots of magic.
Hmm.
But I guess the way that I played it with that one is I was like, well, I'm going to be just as rigorous with my rules of magic as I am with my rules of historical research. So I have to know all the details of this magic. I need to really think through everything that it might be doing to the society at the time
Wow, okay,
because
so this
it's
is
going to impact
baked
stuff.
into, it's normalized, it's not like
Yes.
Harry Potter and it's sort of external.
No, it's just baked into the world. This is how
Ah.
they do things. They have this magical system, and it has to be as much a part of
Mhm.
ordinary life as paying your taxes, and that's just going to be how it is. And with other things that I have going on, like the Peter Pan reimagining, it's simply one character has a kind of weird ability,
Mhm.
and that ability plays into the storyline in a big way, but it's kind of a specific to her thing. It doesn't have
Mhm.
to do with the rest of the world as a whole.
Yeah.
And while it impacts the events of the story,
Mhm.
it doesn't necessarily change the world around her. And I
Yeah.
think that's the decision you kind of have to make. Is the magic going to impact the world as a whole, or
Mhm.
is it simply going to impact this character and how he or she relates to that world?
Yeah. Yeah. What is there anything, any surprising, funny, or interesting things that maybe you didn't realize, but as you started working out the rules of your magic system and then applying it to the world, like, oh, I would never have thought that someone could do X. Anything come up like that?
Um, I don't know. I'm thinking of the one with the lots and lots of magic. And
Hmm.
I think actually this is totally random, but I fused it together with like the obsession with kitchen appliances of the 1960s.
Okay.
That might sound very random, but basically the idea that, oh my gosh, 1960s, all this technology is suddenly in people's houses where they have all these gizmos and gadgets. They've got televisions and radios and record players, and they have washing machines and dryers and dishwashers and all these things that all the modern conveniences, and everybody's after these things. And I was like, great, all of them run on magic now. So bringing that in
Hmm.
terms of like how does that work with the world, how does that work with the class differences in the world, the class differences being related to how the magic works. So
Hmm.
using something that became like in the 1960s, this was such a big thing of, do you have the latest thing for your house that your neighbor also has,
Hmm.
but also weaving that into how magic and class work in that society.
That's intriguing. I want to hear more about that. So, what did you account for? This is side tangent thing, but
Mhm.
how did you account for the origin of magic in your story, such that it's normalized?
Um, Basically, I had it sort of related to just how human beings were created, in the idea that
Okay.
it's simply either you have there are two branches of the magic. Either you have magic that is kind of an innate talent, it's a particular gift and you just have it,
Hmm.
or you have magic that can be learned and it's a
Hmm.
language. And that language is specifically related to basically communicating with the gods on some level.
Ooh, you have gods in there too. Okay, I got to ask about that. Let's
Little
come
g
back.
gods.
Little G. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Keep going.
It's very much in the sense of maybe like a C.S. Lewis's space trilogy has little g gods, I guess, if you could call it that. They're more like angelic beings, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Or, for example, in Tolkien, you have the Valar,
Hmm.
where you have these incredibly powerful beings which are above
Yeah, above
everything
humans,
else in the
below
world.
the Trinity. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So, in a sense, the magical language in this world that I created is simply a way of
Mm.
communicating directly with these forces and asking them for things.
Yeah. There's I'm trying to remember. What is the second movie after Fantastic Beasts? Crimes of Grindelwald, I think.
Okay, sure.
I think is the second one. Yeah, because then Dumbledore is the third one. There's the end of that Crimes of Grindelwald where they were like, we have to stop humanity from mucking around and use magic, or else we have this vision of the future where a war is going to break out. And at that moment, I thought, wow, that is so smart to try to create an alternate twist on history. And then you can sort of see like, oh, well, I guess they failed because we did end up with that in our timeline.
Yeah.
What's a story that you have read that you loved where that's maybe historical fantasy, where the immersion was cool enough to just rivet you throughout the whole thing? And maybe you already mentioned it.
Yeah, I'd have to go back to The Apothecary by Miley
Okay.
Malloy, honestly. Where I think it's a section of history that, I mean, at least when the book came out, was not something a lot of people were thinking about. I think it is more now because of the recent Oppenheimer movie. But this period in the 50s when nuclear tests were going on constantly. And there's actually a moratorium placed on nuclear testing in the late 50s. But you had this like section of time where they're just shooting off atomic bombs all over the place just to see what they'll do and trying to make bigger ones. And that kind of threat of nuclear war and reading about it and being like, well, this is actually legitimately terrifying. And that's the historical part of the book.
Yeah.
And then having the magical part of the book be characters creating a kind of magical net that can surround the energy and bring it back into itself.
Is that part of your story, or that's The Apothecary?
That's The Apothecary.
I was going to say, that's where that needs to go. Okay, that's
Yes.
cool.
And I mean, isn't that, it was just to me so clever that it managed to take a very real historical thing that is legitimately scary and then bring in this magical element. So yeah.
That's fascinating. Any final points you'd like to leave with us in terms of research and immersion?
I think I'd mostly just say have fun with it. It is really fun. I personally find it really fun to do the research. And I think that you can go about it in a way that is fun for you. If you don't particularly like to sit in the reference section of the library, but man, you love podcasts, also a great way of researching, you know? There's so many formats that are available to us at this point in time that you can probably find one that is engaging for you.
Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah, I want to leave everybody with a little personal cautionary tale where I was writing a novel like 15, 20 years ago, maybe. It's a long time now. And I was describing a scene where some characters are like walking home and they've just shot a deer and they're taking it back to the village. And I started trying to describe the environment and realized, hey, I don't know what flowers are growing in Northern Europe in spring. And so I stopped writing because I didn't know where to start that research. So instead of just bracketing it or following the trick of my character's a warrior wannabe, he would not be paying attention to flowers. Instead of learning that little trick, I stopped writing the whole novel. Now, as it turns out, it was probably fine anyway because it needed a lot more time to simmer. But for those who are trying to write, if you're not sure how to handle your writing, it's a really good idea to find some. It's like focus on your research, and then to think about if you're an archaeologist entering into a room, you're going to notice things that a warrior walking into a room would not notice. A warrior would look for specific things. Archaeologist is going to see other things. A dad with a hurting child is going to scan their environment for very specific cues, or somebody who is lost and alone, or somebody who is super successful. So those points of view, they can help you constrain how much research you need to do, because you can then go out and find out what they would pay attention to and then what's relevant to them. Now, the cool thing about research is then everything touches everything. So you can then find new things that would then intrude on them that they had not prepared for, which as a reader is the kind of thing we delight in. It's like, you're an accountant who is a genius. Let's drop you in an island full of dinosaurs. Let's see how you respond, So that was random. Yeah. But that we love that. Like how much do you know about, how you're going about this and how committed are you to the character?
Yeah. And I would add to that, you don't have to know everything in order to start your draft. like you said, you can bracket things. I'm writing
Mhm.
something right now where I'm really just at the beginning of the research, but I'm enjoying the drafting process, and I'm
Mhm.
just kind of going with it and saying, I have rounds and rounds and rounds of revisions ahead of me. I can
Mhm.
add in more detail as I go, and I don't need to know all of it to get a first draft done.
Right. Great. Last question. What is your experience working with Anjanette? We've had a couple of conversations with her talking about how
Yeah.
cool it is. And of course, she's so happy to help everybody. And now we've got
Mhm.
one of our first people who have actually gone through that process. So what are you doing right now? And what is it like?
It's been great. She's the the great thing about having an agent really is, I mean, this is why I wanted to kind of see that secret that representation is just to
Mhm.
not be alone in the process of working with a publisher.
Mhm.
Where I think that you, as an author working with a company, even a small company, can feel like, I don't know what I'm able to do. Like, I don't know how much clout I actually have.
Yeah.
And a sense of, well, the work is mine, but I'm getting, a lot of opinions and thoughts and ways
Mhm.
that I need to change it. And obviously working well with the publisher, but having somebody in your corner who can step in and tell you, okay, this is what you can expect. This is what you should push back on. This is where I'd suggest that you kind of work on this or go with their suggestion on this.
Mhm.
Just it takes a lot of stress out of it.
Yeah.
And also for someone like me, not having to work through all the legal details is phenomenal. So having somebody in there to deal with the contract
Mhm.
side of things is also great. I think mostly you as a writer get to just be a writer, and many of the very difficult things about publishing are no longer your primary concern.
Mhm. That's fantastic. Well, for everybody who heads on over to your website and joins your mailing list, you'd mentioned having a little something to give to one random winner. What do you have?
Yes. I would love to send just either, I think, a full version of a two-part short story that was recently published. So I'd be happy to share the novella length version of a short story that is coming out in late September called Peter and the Never Girl. So that's the Peter Pan reimagining. If you want to see that coffee pot on the shelf, this story is for you.
Fantastic. So, links are in the description, friends. Head down there, follow the link over to Tasha's website, subscribe to be in the winning for an early release or a copy of her story, and then hit the other link to head over to LegendHaven. Join us for free for it's a full day of hangouts and meetups and chats and just having fun with other readers and writers of sci-fi and fantasy fiction, primarily Catholic and Orthodox, but hey, it's free for all and all are welcome. So thanks again, Tasha. It was fun to spend time with you. Good luck with your novel, and we can't wait to have you back to talk about it when it is launched. So
Thank you so much.
till next time, everyone, keep writing, and we'll see you at the con. God bless.